Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior AP English, and our objective now for the hour is to introduce you, and that's about all we're going to do, to arguably the great poet, maybe the greatest poet of the 20th century, W.B. Yeats. Now, there is some debate about this one, and when the names start being thrown out in regards to the greatest poet of the 20th century, if Yeats is not mentioned as one, he's usually mentioned as two because T.S. Eliot is mentioned as one. We will then study for the next 2 weeks the work of Yeats and Eliot. We'll see them as contemporaries to some degree, although in many ways Yeats is going to be the last of the great romantics in ways that we will speak of in a moment. But I'm actually not going to start necessarily just with Yeats. I'll be working as well with a poetic tradition that is what we will call the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The challenge was as follows. You can go and look. By the way, I'm not making this up. You can go and look at newspapers from December of 1899. This is a fascinating study, and I recommend it for you. In December of 1899, we are in, of course, our final year of a century. We are ready for 1900. And we are aware of what? When we read. Fascinating study. The optimism is prodigious. There are essays where you will read the following. The next century, the century you were born in, the next century will be the great century of peace. Science will have figured out a way to feed everyone. So, are you ready for this? There will be no starving children in this next century. We will be able to grow so much food that we will be able to feed everyone. We will in turn be able, because of our textile mills and the like, be able to clothe everyone. And there will be, because of science of medicine, longer life. We can remove all major illnesses in the next century. The optimism is unbelievably high. And 14 years later, what we, in hindsight, will call the First World War, and then just a few years after that, the Second World War, and then a few years after that, the conflicts of Asia, Korea, Vietnam. So that by the time you're born, more people have died because of war than in the history of the world. What happened? That optimism lost 14 years into the 20th century, the century of your birth. And then the ongoing kind of downward spiraling of violence, as it, of course, is combined with the unbelievable accomplishments of technology. The amount of power in the two weapons dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima are mind-boggling. There is absolutely no way Marcus Aurelius could have ever imagined that you could drop a single weapon and it would destroy not only the life that immediately it struck, but it could destroy life up to years later by virtue of just simply the radioactivity left in the air or in the ground or in the water, beyond imagining in the last year of the 18th century. The optimism is unbelievably high. It stands to reason that sensitive, feeling poets will be damaged. And they were. And they were. The two voices that we will look at in unison, poetically, will be Yeats and Eliot. Both of them are aware something wrong is about to happen. We'll begin with Yeats. When you look at Yeats, he is an interesting figure. He will grow up Irish. He will grow up with a strong connection to two things. One, like many of the poets that came before him, he has a strong connection with classical poetry. So he knows the Greeks, he knows the Romans, and he loves those poets, and he loves those writers. He will memorize huge chunks of Homer, that kind of thing. But number two, because he's Irish, he's also really interested in the mythology of Ireland. And so Yeats will become a great patriotic voice for the Irish people. But significantly important, Yeats is aware something is going wrong. There is something that will soon be lost that Wordsworth was already talking about when he said, "We've given our hearts away a sordid boon." In his poem, "The World is Too Much With Us." Something is now gone, are you ready for this? That maybe won't come back ever again. For example, in his poem, Second Coming, a poem that I'll maybe speak to in another lecture in more detail, on page 1171, notice the opening lines of this poem. "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer." For those of you who have ever been familiar, are you familiar at all with this amazing thing? A falconer can take this falcon and send it away, whistle or have a voice of some kind, and the bird will return right back to the arm. It's quite remarkable. These birds can be trained this way. Yeats is clearly not speaking about men and birds. He's using a word picture. Something is wrong with our culture. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. Achebe's great novel, of course, will borrow from this poem its title. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. It's like when you were a child and you were taken to the park and a really strong adult could spin you on that one little thing that went round, 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 and you were holding on, but as you went faster and faster, your feet started to kind of give way, and it was harder to hold on to the center. It's like we're spinning, but we're spinning so fast that everything's starting to fall apart. The center can't hold. Keep reading. Again, this poem written before 1914, and the horrors to follow. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. If you will, in 1800, Blake will write songs of innocence. By 1900, there's no more innocence to be found. It's been, his verb here is, drowned in a river of blood. To finish, and of course, to forecast, this poem was written before Chamberlain would get off his famous plane, where he said, no, I looked the man in the eye, and he's a man to be trusted, speaking, of course, of Adolf Hitler. Tragically so, Hitler would turn around just a few hours later and begin that terrible tide of blood and, obviously, Holocaust. The best, look what he says. This is Yeats, prophetic voice, Yeats. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. We think about the murderers of the 20th century, and immediately we think of a line like this, don't we? We think of Hitler, we think of Mussolini, we think of Stalin, we think of Lenin, and we think, of course, of the great Mao Zedong, who, when you put all those cats together, they will have murdered more people in the history of their rise to power than could ever have been imagined in the 18th century. A lot of it's just technology, right? I mean, you had the ability by the beginning of the 20th century to kill large numbers of people in mass, and it would change the psyche in Europe. It completely changed this. In one day on the German front, in France, on the French front in the First World War, in one day, 50,000 people lost their lives. In one day. I mean, this was unheard of when you're killing people by stabbing them to death. It's awfully hard to do that even in the American Civil War. And yet, just a few years later, because of the technologies, of course, the mustard gas, the germ warfare, all of that kind of stuff. With that in mind, we will now turn to Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium. And there is no doubt that when you look at the poetry, the collective of Yeats, the challenge is to find the one poem that stands above all others. X.J. Kennedy, I think I shared with you, once was asked in an interview, the great anthologizer of poetry. The cat had read pretty much every poem because he was writing these college anthologies where he would put several thousand poems together in an anthology, right? And then university students had to read these poems. So he obviously was reading a lot more poems than the ones that made it into his anthology. And so a journalist just asked him, best poem in the English language is what? He thought he would stomp the classic anthologist, and without batting an eye, apparently, X.J. Kennedy came back and said the greatest poem in the English language is W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, which shocked a lot of us, including the journalists who received the answer, to go back and look at this poem one more time. Kennedy saying, you just can't hardly write a poem better than this poem. Well, with that in mind, let's, if for no other reason, let's go ahead and investigate what is it that makes this poem so remarkable And now I'm working specifically with this poem. But I'm actually not going to start here. I'm going to start actually with another title for you. As I finish my hours with you, I find myself aware of how much more there is to be said that I'm not going to have time to say. One of those is helping you make that list of the books that you will be reading long after your high school career. A student who I taught over 20 years ago wrote to me the other day and said, that list you gave to me, you gave to us in AP, I'm still working through it. And I smiled. I knew what he meant. We have been making that list over the course of the 2 years together. Let me add one more for you. The great writer Plutarch and his great classic Lives. It is a classic write and read. He's one of the inventors of what we today would call biography. And in one of those chapters on Theseus, he tells an intriguing story about what is called the craft or the ship of Theseus. Theseus, of course, is the great killer of the Mentor. He's the great mind who's able to figure out the labyrinth and all of that and get away. The ship that he sails on becomes, if you will, a treasured hallmark, and it's placed inside of a museum. But of course, as wood often will do, because it's been in an ocean for a long time, the wood begins to deteriorate. And over time, pieces of the ship start falling off in the display. And so there's replacement wood brought in. And so as a plank falls off, a new plank is returned. Another plank falls off, a new one is returned. You can see how this works. Over a period of time, the ship begins to be rebuilt. It looks exactly like the old ship, but the wood in the ship is different. Now, the paradox, as it's often referred to of Theseus, becomes an existential paradox. It becomes a working word picture, and it runs something like this. At what point was the ship of Theseus no longer the ship of Theseus? At what point was enough wood put onto this ship that had not been part of the original voyage that you no longer could say it was the actual ship of Theseus? Was it when the first piece of wood was placed there? Because the majority of the ship obviously was the original. Was it at 50%? Or was it rather when it became 51%? That you would say, while it's a pretty ship, and it certainly is a facsimile of what was sailing, away, but it's not the same ship anymore. Of course, this will beg by the 20th century an intriguing question. While you've been sitting here listening to me for the last 10 minutes, we know what's been going on at the molecular level in your cells. We're familiar. Our biology will teach us, of course, that while I've been speaking, you've been changing. Some of your cells have been dying, others to be regenerated. This is, of course, what we know about cell biology, which begs a really intriguing question. At the molecular level, who are you? Because we know, certainly, you are not, in terms of your cells, you are not what you were 10 years ago. We are familiar with that. I mean, all biology teaches us that. But you didn't need Miss Barnes to tell you that. All you had to do was go and look at your picture from school 10 years ago, which would put you in second grade. You didn't look the same back then. Well, maybe one or two of us did. But most of us didn't look the same, right? Okay. At what point do you stop being you and start being somebody else? And of course, this question will become more prescient for you as you watch people in front of you age. This will become a fascinating case study for you. And this is where we begin with Sailing to Byzantium. Let's turn to it now. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium is a poem that at 2B we will begin by saying is a dramatic monologue. Now you can see in the Victorian era we've been doing this dramatic monologue game a lot. Again, just to remind, two primary elements. Notice how when you learn one thing, it can help you to learn something else, right? We've been playing the game of dramatic monologue, so as I recite this or repeat this to you, you'll go, oh yeah, I remember that. One, we're always asking who the speaker is. Two, we're always asking about the dramatic context. Okay. Yeats was very interested in a question. It's a two-part question. Question one. You might jot it down. And, of course, be careful as you think about potential answers in driving. It's kind of like texting. It's dangerous. Question one, who are you? By extension, of course, who's everybody else, too? Who are you? I mean, quite literally, who are you? What are you made up of? What defines you as you and your identity? And you can all remember in middle school when, for example, one morning you woke up and decided, you decreed out loud, today I will not speak with X or Y or Z. Today I will be a different me than I have ever been before. Some of us were playing that game long into our high school career, where we constantly were asking, am I really the clothes I wear? Am I really the hair design? Am I really the friends I choose to associate with or not associate with? Who am I? And then, of course, by extension, more interestingly, who are all these other people that I visit and that I meet, that I rub shoulders with? One of the most beautiful things about travel is that you meet people from other cultures, and you have to identify right away. They are not the foreign when they look at me. They are natives. I am the foreign. And to that degree, who are they? Question one. Question two. Whoever you think you are, you're going to constitute that as someone alive, correct? So it's a simple question two. What is death then? What is death? And who dies? And if you're going to call death cessation of some kind, which it seems to be the case in regards to the physical body, then what happens once that body gets put in the ground? Of course, for those of you that enjoyed, if not enjoyed, endured, Tom Stoppart's classic Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, you're familiar with that famous scene where Rosencrantz will say, you know, being put in a box under the ground, I suppose you'd rather be alive than dead in a box under the ground, playing games with the question of what happens post-mortem. Where does one go? In the history of the world, there are two answers, broadly speaking. I suppose there are three, but the third, or the first, as I'll outline it, is a non-answer. The three answers of what happens after you die. By the way, this question is a question of eschatology, often referred to as afterlife. What happens? Answer one is a non-answer. Well, I'll tell you what happens. Nothing happens. That's because all you are atoms in the void. The minute your molecules, your cells, after you're dead, once you flatline, they put you in the ground, and as Hamlet will remind Claudius, you become maggots. Meal. That's what you are. There's nothing more to it than that. You pity the cow who stands in the meadow because soon he will become a Big Mac. He pities you because soon you will become a Big Mac for maggots. That's what will happen. And after that, there's no reason to become upset about that. That's just called the way the world is. You'll learn that from the moment that you flushed your first goldfish down the toilet after, of course, he decided he needed to make his emancipation from the little bowl you had him in, or something like that, you see. Some kitty cat that got borrowed under the the tire of a car, something like that. But the other question, the other answers are twofold. And of course, post-mortem, as we spoke about in our Dante lecture, are either linear or cyclical. The linear answer is a simple one. You live, you die, and then your body dies, but something other than your body, call it spirit, call it soul, call it mind, call it whatever you wish, it has some kind of life after, but it does not return to this kind of life. There is some kind of judgment, reward, punishment system in play, and in the great religions or wisdom traditions of the world, this is often, of course, understood as the great day of judgment. Number two. The second answer is actually every bit as popular, and some would argue more popular in the history of the world, and that's the cyclical answer. It's the answer, of course, of the ancient Greeks. That's the answer that says, you live, you die, but what dies is only the physical body. And then that soul of yours, or spirit, reanimates or reincarnates. It comes back. The Greeks had this notion that from the river Lethe, a special river in Styx where everyone goes, you drink to remove all memories, and then you reincarnate again. You come back. Of course, you know this if you read Plato's Republic 10, right? One of the important myths in that final book of Republic is the idea that you could choose what you get to come back as. Do you want to come back as a great and mighty warrior? Do you want to come back as some kind of animal? Or do you want to come back as basically a nobody? Because when you come back as a nobody, there's no pressure on you to have to do anything. All you get to do is just enjoy the life you got, and then you die. You see, this is the Republic 10 question. Now to Yeats. Yeats really loved this question. He loved this question because it was a personal question for him. On two counts. One, he had several close pals who died. And it wasn't just enough for him to say, oh, yeah, when they die, they go to heaven. Right, got it. Let's get on with life. He was more analytical than that. And so he had to ask more profound questions like, do I have even a single 1% shred of proof that after death, there is this thing called heaven? Do I even have 1% bit of proof, speaking in mathematical language? Do I even have 1%? Forget about 100%. Do I even have 1%? And of course, if you offer to me some kind of work of authority, namely some kind of a religious text, the obvious question of that is, well, yeah, but come on, give me the proof that what I'm reading there qualifies as 1% or more of real, verifiable, documentable evidence. What really happens to my pals? Then he started to look in a mirror and recognized, as soon you will soon recognize, oh wait, I'm getting older too, which means that I myself must soon stop breathing, which means that what happens to me after I go? For Yeats, this becomes such a powerful question that for a number of years, he reads and studies all of the world's mythic literature. He's pretty much kind of an encyclopedia mind in this regard. He wants to know, what has everybody that I can read said on this topic? And in the process, he came to a reincarnative view. He believed that the reincarnative view actually answers the theodictic question than does the linear view. In other words, the argument of karma. In other words, you build up certain kinds of actions in your life for which you either are rewarded or you pay for in your next return life. And over a course of millions of lives, you gain knowledge. He saw this as a very optimistic view as well. Using that word picture, he then wrote a poem about what it means to live and to die. He asked an intriguing question about the world he was living in. We will now use the term modern. For the first time, we now are using that word when we're talking Yeats. We today, of course, will speak of our time period as either postmodern or, as many academics now call it, postmodern. Yeats saw himself, he was aware, especially after the First World War, he was living in a modern era. This was not the era of Shakespeare. This was not even the era of, we might say, Pope and Swift. This was a different era. It was a modern era. What kind of world is it? Now to the poem. It is a dramatic monologue. The only way this poem makes sense is if you understand two primary pieces of information. Once you know these, this poem will make total sense to you. One, the speaker of the poem is an old man. You must picture him as such. A very old man. An old man who will soon no longer be a man, because he soon must die. What he will call in part two, paltry man. He's ready to fall apart. He looks like a scarecrow. He's so old. Two, this old man is in a boat, and he is sailing away from a country, from land, borrowing, of course, from Tennyson's Crossing the Bar and all of that. The old man, looking back to the country from which he's leaving, says, "That is no country for old men." The great Cormac McCarthy, of course, will borrow this title for his classic novel, which will in turn become, of course, the movie that receives the Academy Award victory, No Country for Old Men. That, he says, is no country for old men. Has the thought occurred to you, this is not a world for the old? Watch television, and more particularly commercials, and you will be reminded, this is not a world for the old. The last time you saw a commercial of, like a beer commercial, where you saw ancient, elderly people, no, this is not a world for the old. It's a world for who? Look at the next line. The young, in one another's arms. This is not just a world for the young. It's a world for the young who are interested in Plato's box 1. Remember our 2 boxes? This is a world for the young, in one another's arms. The birds in the trees, their dying generations at their song. Listen to the song of a bird. And of course, it is beautiful and melodic, but it also must sooner or later end. All things have their coming and, of course, their going. The old man in the boat is dying. He pictures his death as a journey in a boat. And about the country which he has lived in, he looks back over his shoulder and says, That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms. The birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel-crowded seas. Fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long. And then for those of you who are Lion King fans, you know all about the great circle of life. Whatever is, what is it? Begotten, born, and dies, right? There it is, right? Two people hook up and exchange fluids. You are conceived, you are born, you live for a few moments, and then you die. That is called your life. But then notice what he says next about those young in one another's arms. As one senior once said, this above all poems that we've read this year is the most clearly indicative towards me because I'm young reading this. And I said, well, yeah, that's right. Intentionally so. Yeats loved young readers. And he wrote his poetry assuming, much like Whitman, there would be young readers who would read it. Notice what he says about you. Caught in that sensual music. All neglect. Monuments of an aging intellect. Now that's an interesting word picture. If you want to catch mackerel, one way to do it, any fish really, is to just cast a net out. The water, of course, will go through the holes of the net, but the fish will get caught in the net. And then as the net starts to come up, the fish will begin to work hard. Now you're thinking Nemo, I know. The fish will try to work hard to try to find their extrication, their emancipation. Sorry to break, the myth. But of course, most of the time, the fish don't get out. They are caught in the net. The word picture here is an interesting one. Young people are caught in a net. They are, of course, in one another's arms, enjoying the song of the birds and all of that. What is it they're caught in? In that, notice, sensual, right, music. And therefore, they neglect what? Monuments of unaging intellect. Now, I don't want to insult Mr. Schreiber. And so I hope that as I say this, I don't. I may be wrong about what I'm about to say. But something tells me that in 100 years from now, probably not very many people are going to be listening to the music of Britney Spears. Now, again, I don't wish to insult, and we can fight about this if you so wish. But something tells me that in 250 years from now, the music of Justin Bieber will have found its happy, or maybe not so happy, end. And nobody will listen to that music anymore. They will see it as what it was for its time. But, and here again I may be wrong, but it seems to me that I can predict that 300 years from now, people will still be listening to Beethoven's Ninth. Now, I'm not asking you whether you like Beethoven's Ninth or not. Yeats would say, the chances are really good. You don't even know what I mean when I say Beethoven's Ninth. But that's because you're caught in sensual music in which you neglect monuments of an aging intellect. In other words, we're not interested in what you like. We're interested in what lasts. And this begs a really intriguing question. One, I'm so intrigued by, I'm going to ask you to write on it. Even though I couldn't decipher my own calligraphy to remind me, I now recall. The question is a simple one. It's one that many of my seniors have said, you ask a lot of intriguing questions in 303, but this has to be one that I just cannot so easily answer, and it's this. What for you in your generation is a monument of unaging intellect? I'll ask this question several times for your notes. Another way to ask this question is this. What are you enjoying and experiencing that was created in your lifetime? Pick, of course, the year of your birth as the starting point of your discourse. Can't be before. So don't tell me, for example, that you believe that in 100 years from now they'll still be listening to the music of Led Zeppelin or listening to the music of Jimi Hendrix. I believe you and I agree with you, but that is not your music. You may listen to it, but that is not your music. I'm asking you from your time period. That is to say, from the moment you were conceived and born. That's what I mean by your time period. I'm interested in you trying to answer this question. In 250 or 300 years from now, is there any music that was created in my lifetime that people will still be listening to in 300 years? Let's make a quick list, because some of you will struggle if all we do is stick to music. How about movies? How about movies? Are there any movies from your lifetime that you believe will still be watched in 300 years? See, because I can argue that Francis Ford Coppola's 3 Godfather films, certainly Godfather 1, 2, I feel pretty confident those films are still going to be watched in 300 years. Of course, that great list that posits the greatest films Hollywood ever produced, like Citizen Kane and others, we don't really doubt or debate the fact that as long as people are watching film, probably going to watch that movie. Some of you will even say, you know, maybe a film like Titanic will someday get that kind of credibility, but that's not from your generation. That film...
Boom.
That film...
3.
You can't constitute that as film from your... Of course, whether Titanic is watched in 300 years or not, that's a debate. Would you agree with me? The question, what about books? Are there any books written? Of course, some of you will say, dude, I've been reading in school lots and lots of books, but none of them really written during my lifetime.
Okay, John.
Which begs a really intriguing question. Is there anything written during the time you've been alive that will be read in 300 years? We could go on. What about TV shows? What about video games? See, this is an interesting question for my gamers. Do you honestly believe there is a single video game from your generation, from your time, that will actually still be played in the gaming community 300 years from now? Or will all of those games gone, you know, the way of Atari? They are left for the Smithsonian Museum of Gaming, right? And on it goes. Do you feel there are any monuments of an aging intellect that are a part of your time? See, because in 300 years, they'll still be listening to the music of the Beatles, I'm guessing. They'll still be listening to the music of Mozart. That's Yeats' insight. There is stuff that lasts. In a word, we call it art. The question is, has any of it been produced in your time? Or rather, are you, if not a product, a victim of a generation in time that produces lots and lots of stuff, but none of it lasts? None of it has any kind of real staying power. None of it is a monument of an aging intellect. Write that paper for me. Part 2. What does he want to say about old people? Next time you take a look at your parents, try and see them as 30 or 40 years older than they are. It's an intriguing exercise. Some of you will say, and of course this is maybe no joking, some of you will say 40 years from now the people I live with will no longer exist because we'll be pushing against the envelope of insurance premiums and the like. Others of us will say, 40 years from now that puts my parents into the late 80s, 90s, and I don't know, that's really pushing against the margin. What does he say? An aged man is but a paltry thing. What's a paltry thing? Well, in the spring, a leaf's going to be beautiful and green. In fact, if you put a brand new leaf in your palm and went like this, it just kind of balls up and gets green and spoils your palm of your hand with green. Come in October to the same leaf as it's fallen off of the tree and landed on the floor, and now it's brown, and pick it up, put it in your palm, and go like this, and upon opening it, that's paltry. It's gone. That's the stingy of the old people. It's so fine. You want to touch it because you're convinced it's almost unreal. It's like a really overused paper bag that's kind of shrivelly and all yucky. An aged man, and for those of you that are going, oh, that's so gross, you're back to part 1 of Yeats. Right. Young people live as if they don't understand. They're all paper bags that are going to get used up way too much. And they're all going to look old, no matter how many surgeries you get. Because, 2 years after you're under the ground, it doesn't matter. It all looks the same to maggots. That's Hamlet's observation, isn't it, in 4:4 of Hamlet? An aged man is but a paltry thing. A tattered coat upon a stick. Uh-oh, this is an important word picture. An old person is kind of like a scarecrow. I don't know if you've ever had the privilege of being with someone who's really old. Often males especially. It's fascinating.